Anna libánská, who has whispered to me that the context about which she will be talking has many similarities to what we have just heard from Andreja. So Anna libánská is an activist and a PhD student at the Center for Iberian American Studies at Charles University of Prague. In her presentation here, she will also focus on the reception of and on the colonial discourse and kind of the nation building within the context of Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia later. Please take over.
So the topic of my lecture is representation of the indigenous population of Americas in Czech pop culture and the identification of the discourses that shape it. I am focusing on the period between 1948 to 1989, a period when cultural concepts and ideas were highly influenced by the specific context of the socialist regime and the struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union for global dominion. The aim of the case study is to point out the paradoxical situation in which, on the one hand, the textual representation of the so-called American Indian was strongly influenced by the anti-colonial discourses, and a prototype of American Indian was constructed as a heroic fighter against imperialism. And, on the other hand, however, the representations continued to replicate stereotypes rooted in the European colonial imagination. For this case study, I'm analyzing one of the most popular magazines in socialist Czechoslovakia called Mladý, svět, Young World. The term American Indian, which I'm using here, can be understood as a name for a set of various stereotyping statements about the indigenous population of the Americas, predominantly men. The construct of American Indian largely followed the older tradition of textual representations in which men predominated. If women appeared in the texts, they were often only in the role of passive objects who served, for example, as a means of exchange between feuding tribes, as war booty, or appeared in the role of victims who were massacred in American Indian wars. The use of Indian themes and symbolism by various social groups has a long tradition throughout Central Europe. Each social group projected its own values, ideals, norms, and stereotypes into its construction of the American Indian image. Representations of the Indian were also not infrequently shared by the homogenization of indigenous ethnic groups from different parts of the American continent, who in their representations share the same features, appearance, and a culture which was portrayed as less civilized than the European one. The image material used, however, comes not only from Mladý, svět, but also from other pop culture production of 20th century, and serves mainly to give you a better idea of the types of representation which I mentioned. Okay, so now brief introduction to Mladý, svět magazine. So the magazine was a popular weekly magazine for young audience in socialist Czechoslovakia, published under the banner of the Czechoslovak Union of Youth from January 1959 by Mladá fronta, which means Young Front, and Mladá fronta had its roots in Czech youth resistance organization during the Second World War. This organization was subordinated by the Communist Party. But the title, however, still retained a certain independence. The medium was one of the largest circulating magazines in Czechoslovakia, and its popularity among the readers was probably due to the breadth of the topics and the fact that published text seemed to deviate from the unified party line and maintain an impression of plurality. Articles on current political and cultural events in Czechoslovakia and the world appeared on its pages. It can be concluded that the Mladý svět was an important source of information about the world for many, not only young people, and it also helped them to shape ideas about the world, which making it interesting for the study of cultural representation. I focus primarily on the historical or cultural politics of representation, and I am therefore interested in the specific discourses of the time within which representations were created and used. One of the most prevalent tropes in popular culture at the time, and also in the pages of Mladý svět, was undoubtedly the American Indian as the noble savage. The concept of the American Indian as the noble savage is typically associated with a life in harmony with nature and an unspecified natural wisdom, which is the subject of admiration and inspiration in the text. However, at the same time, it is constructed as an ideal that is unattainable for modern man. The noble savage personifies certain social norms of the time, yet he simultaneously exists outside of the modern world. He is a child of nature and living fossil, a reminder to modern people of their primitive life before the emergence of civilization, the age of innocence. As a child of nature, he is infantilized. The noble savage, unseparated from nature, is situated in a mythical, timeless world that exists parallel to the modern world. However, this pre-modern world is gradually disappearing, along with its inhabitants. In the text, the noble savage is often used as a means of criticizing Western civilization and consumerism. The Indian teacher. The text made it clear that although the noble savage can serve as a source of inspiration for us, modern man is not able and indeed should not attempt to revert to a primitive way of life due to his separation from nature. Nevertheless, it's possible that he may learn something from the Indian noble savage. The Indian teacher figure may serve as an exemplar in the domain of individual moral conduct and social interaction. Although the magazine's reference to good morals primarily concerns the socials, ideals and norms projected by the writers on the Indians. In the pages of Mladý svět, the Indians were known to be truthful, sparing in their use of words, and stable in their society and clan system. It was also reported that the Indians elected their own chief rulers, which made their society an ideal of democracy. Furthermore, the peaceful resolution of disputes at the peace pipe was seen as a means of facilitating democracy. The Indian society depicted in the magazine is characterized by a strong collectivist orientation, which is reflected in a deep-seated opposition to individualism. For example, in one article, we read that a Mohawk princess was stripped of her title because she used the words I and mine too often. Indian society is constructed as a selfless society with a sense of fair play, whose establishment, at least until the degradation brought by contact with Western civilization, was in many ways exemplary and alien to falsehood. The idea of the American Indian teacher is perhaps best summed up by quotation allegedly made by the German philosopher Johann Georg Hamann and sent to the column called Campfire. The Indian may not know much, but what he knows is worth learning from him. The figure of the American Indian is thus associated with the natural wisdom, but not with modern rationality, even though this non-modern Indian has much to offer modern men and much to inspire him. The idea of American Indians as teachers about nature was widespread. For example, in tramp culture, that in the Czechoslovak movement incorporates woodcraft, camping and also Boy Scout. In the pages of Mladý svět, an Indian son of nature taught the tramps how to survive in the wilderness, even if that wilderness sometimes just means leaving the capital. The Indian son of nature is the trope of the Indian living in harmony with nature. Sorry, I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay. This mode of representation is not only present in indigenous people living in place where, I quote, technological progress has not yet begun, as a 1968 article on the Brazilian Amazon puts it. The Chippewas, for example, are referred to, quote, simple son of nature in the 1965 text. The text discusses their deployment on the Western Front in World War I. Despite the fact that these Chippewas live in the modern world, they do not become part of it and are unable to stand in it. According to the text, as children of nature, they were defenseless against modern technology and so, quote, were among the first victims of the massacre that civilization had prepared with machine guns and iparits. On the other hand, when it comes to survival in the wilderness, as I have already mentioned, the white man is no match for it. The Indian son of nature is able to overcome all the pitfalls of the wilderness even with the most minimalist equipment, for he is, as we learn in 1971 text, and I quote, a member of a race that has constantly fought against the forest, against the beast, and against the people. The Indian son of nature is thus not only an Indian teacher, but also an Indian warrior, embodying the ideal of hegemonic masculinity. At the same time, he is able to make effective use of natural resources without destroying nature and is very frugal in his use of them. He is therefore also Indian ecologist. Thanks to his natural and also natural wisdom, the Indian is able to resist not only the pitfalls of nature, but also to heal himself through its fruits, or on the contrary, to kill thanks to his knowledge of the natural poisons. Many times in the magazine, we come across the image of the Indian as a healer and a connoisseur of natural medicine, who has been working with some of the herbs used in modern medicine for centuries. This is noted, for example, by řičář, a doctor and contributor to Mladý, svět, who, among Indian medicines, quote, with great surprise found medicinal herbs still used in medicine today, end quote, and then asked, quote, how would the development of Indian culture have proceeded if it had not been forcibly interrupted at one time, end quote. However, if a Western scientist knows Indian medicine, he can make better use of that knowledge than the Indian themselves, perhaps because, unlike isolated tribes, the modern scientist can work with the knowledge of multiple tribes simultaneously. The trope of the Indian son of the nature is often accompanied by the trope of the disappearing Indian and the Indian ecologist. The interconnection of this trope is clearly visible in the quote from a 1981 text by the Czech ethnologist Miroslav Zelený, who comments on his quote, sojourn among the wild Indians in the Amazon by saying that the local Indians are, quote, the last ones to live in natural coexistence, almost symbiosis with nature. According to him, Indians do not destroy the environment. They know the laws of nature, they do not have a predatory relationship with nature, and they attach considerable importance to nature in their lives. However, they face the same inexorable fate as the North American Indians, murder, settlement of their territories, and fighting with monopolies. In relation to white men, the Indian son of nature, unalienated from nature, is usually portrayed as a passive object, finding himself either in the position of defenseless victim who suffers the wrongs inflicted upon him by the whites, or in the position of one who is wholly dependent upon white help. Thus, the Indian son of nature in the text often needs protection from whites. Disappearing American Indian. This is because although many competencies are attributed to Indians, they simply do not hold up comparison to modern civilization. The pre-modern Indian world is slowly disappearing from the real world and is being displaced by civilization. The world of the Indian noble savage survives alongside a modern one only as a relic of the past and of the old world, as mentioned, for example, in the article on the disappearing Indians in Guyana. According to the magazine, the world of the North American Indians is also such a disappearing world, as it was constructed by Karl May in his books for Central European readership. Another text, however, notes in a nostalgic tone that this romantic world of the Mayan Indians has not only long since disappeared, but may never have existed anywhere other than in page of Karl May adventure books. Thus, while we do encounter the romanticization of Indians in the page of Mladý, svět, the magazine itself can be critical of it. A 1965 text, for example, warns us that the film and book representation of Native Americans can be somewhat inaccurate and, moreover, change over time. Then another article bluntly states that Native American women are just fairy tales, that Native American novels are just fairy tales, and the real-life Native American have little in common with them. Thus, while one part of the articles tells us that Indians are represented in the pop culture imagination never actually existed, the other part says that they did exist, but that they have either disappeared or are irretrievably disappearing. For example, according to a 1964 article, with the first entry of the conquering pale faces onto American soil, Indian culture was doomed to extinction. Nothing could reverse it. And it was not reversed even by the warriors often mentioned in the page of Mladý, svět, in the context of the theme of the first inhabitants of America and popular in adventure literature, such as Tecumseh or Sitting Bull. Some tribes, such as Mohicans or Hurons, have thus, according to another text, become completely extinct, which is not true. In the Indian disappearance, we can see an analogy with the childhood world of fantastic adventures, which is slowly being replaced by a disenchanted adult world, which is rational world. There is no longer any place for the Indian in the modern world, and as we have already seen, he fails in the clash with it. But to enter a modern world, indigenous peoples are pushed by the settler cultures that at the same time assign them a place on the periphery. In both South and North America, they often reach this imaginary margin after moving to the cities. That is, after leaving, in quotation marks, the Indian environment, a world that is comprehensible and familiar to them. In modern cities, the noble savage become a loser living on the margins of society. The so-called corrupted Indian, as I call this mode of representation, drinks alcohol, is unemployed, lacks education, etc. He is associated with a number of phenomena that are understood as manifestation of so-called social pathology. The spread of so-called social pathologies among the indigenous population is attributed not only to the current political establishment, but along to the activities of white people overseas in general, the activities of early conquistadors, missionaries, and traders. For example, according to 1981 article, it was traders and missionaries who introduced disease and alcoholism to the Indians and caused them to resent the invaders. A number of texts also refer to the seizure of land for the purpose of mineral extraction, which led to the constant impoverishment of the Indians and the violation of the treaties that the whites had previously made with them, so that, quote, legal treaties became increasingly worthless scraps of paper. The violence perpetrated by the whites This resulted not only in the decline of Indians, but also in their moral decline. Their decline was also due to the gradual merging with the white population, which was taking place in some places, as we learned from travelers' accounts from Canada in 1968. Along with the Indian in the Montreal area, their traditions were said to be disappearing, which are now, and I quote, just a dusty show for tourists, end quote, which, moreover, are performed by white men dressed in Iroquois costumes, not the real Indians. They are supposedly paid by the government when they are not working, the article complains. But it's precisely this old and disappearing world of the Indians that becomes an object of fascination in the page of Mladý, svět, and is also constructed here as a form of imaginary return to the golden childhood age. Children and adults across different social groups are fond of playing Indian, which consists, for example, in imitating their everyday life or in playing Indians and cowboys, etc. Playing Indians is seen as an adventure that awaits one after leaving the city for the countryside, where one imaginatively returns to a more primitive way of life and thus becomes, at least for a weekend, a noble savage, or better, an Indian son of nature. We learn from the text that playing Indian was not just a recreational activity. Children, for example, were taught through this game, as the 1983 article states, to behave properly in nature and not to destroy it, not to kill animals, and to be as clever and quick-witted as the Indians. And like them, to try to learn as much as possible about the world around them. Indians were seen as a ticket to other worlds that develop children's imaginations and desirable social behavior. Interestingly, the magazine's assessment of, for example, the Indian hobby movement in France, where weekend dressing up as Indian is seen rather negatively, it's quite different. While in socialist Czechoslovakia, imitating their life leads to the acquisition of socially desirable qualities, in capitalist France, it's rather a contentless pastime practiced by people spoiled by civilization. Indian hobby groups in Germany are portrayed in the same way. While playing Indians is still permissible for children, for adults, the author of article sees as an attempt to avoid confrontation with adult life and to come to terms with Germany's recent past, especially Nazism. But now let us move from the hobbyists back to the Native Americans and how their position in America at the time was portrayed. One of the tropes we find here is that of the oppressed Indian. This trope was also linked to the representation of the United States and the discourse of anti-Americanism. While the US tries to appear as a country of complete freedom, the opposite is true, according to Mladý, svět. The racism of so-called Free America becomes one of the most common means of criticizing it. According to the same article, racism in the United States is directed against African Americans, immigrants, and native inhabitants of the continent. The latter often live below the subsistence level, have their land confiscated, and often turn to alcohol in despair at their plight. Another text described the American Indians as a victim of imperialism and I quote, the most despised minority in the United States. The Mladý, svět repeatedly draws attention to the violation of treaties, unemployment, poor economic conditions of inferior living condition on reservation, from which they are sometimes evicted for the sake of minerals. There is also mention racial segregation, which restrict the Indian population as much as before. But the trope of the oppressed Indian is not only found in texts about the United States. In an excerpt from 1963 travel article about Bolivia, indigenous people are the target of white prejudice. A representative of the white bourgeois complains about the cholas, by which he means the mixed race and urban members of the indigenous population. Quote, "They are dirty, they drink, they don't wash and they stink. Coca-Colas are enough to satisfy them." His wife interjects that the Indians in the village are more polite, but they kill each other. And there are man-eaters and skull-catchers in the forest to the east, where no one can go, she adds. It should be noted that in the following paragraphs, the author of the text, the side of the indigenous people, is on the side of indigenous people, and does his guide through Bolivia, Comrade Ricardo. In the text of Mladý, svět, the American countries, which at the time had friendly relation with socialist Czechoslovakia, leftist countries, treated indigenous people much better. One example is Alvarado's Peru, where the new relationship between the Peruvian state and the Indians is represented by the replacement of the statue of Pizarro with a statue of Tupac Amaru in Lima. American Indians in countries hostile to Eastern Bloc, from the activists of the Wounded Knee or the Mapuche in Chile, excluding the Andes, can also be politically conscious and are supported as such in the magazine. The trope of Native American political activists appears from the early 1970s in the context of the rise of Native American activism. The key events in the United States, which Mladý, svět informs us is in detail. Mladý, svět provides a detailed account of the key events in the United States that led to emergence of the American Indian activist, an American Indian who refuses to be oppressed Indian and instead, as an American Indian warrior, becomes increasingly vocal in his demands for human and clan rights and enters the public sphere, fighting, for example, for the enforcement of treaties concluded between American Indians and the state. On the page of Mladý, svět, the role of Indian activists is most often played by the chief. It's therefore not surprising that the ability to demand better living conditions from the state is presented as a factor that can play an important role in his election. The representation of the American Indian activist also contains the trope of the American Indian warrior. This kind of representation was also largely related to the male-dominated and heteronormative discourses in pop culture images of indigenous people. Thus, we also encounter disproportionate representation of women and persons of other genders, like two-spirit, compared to the numerous representation of American Indian men. One of the exceptions is the Chippewa activist Young Fish, whom the magazine interviewed during the stay in Central Europe. Czechoslovak popular culture was distinctively androcentric in the observed period. The protagonists of the created content, stories, film or television series were therefore mainly men. Their characteristics were superior to those of the, quote, naturally feminine. The construct of American Indian masculinity largely reflected these gender normative concepts. The Indian is constructed as a brave, persistent, and never giving up warrior. Physical strength, bravery, and endurance are associated with the idea of masculine American Indian. Male Indians are further associated with the prudence, muscularity, the near absence of disease, etc. The American Indian warrior trope is most evident in depictions of famous chiefs, who embodied the masculine warrior ideal most of all American Indians and are also the most frequently mentioned Indians by name in texts. Finally, I would like to mention why I think it's important to examine modes of indigenous representation and to be interested in how they were created, what discourses they were built upon, and how they were disseminated, consolidated, replicated, and varied. Studying representation of colonized people allows us to show, among other things, how European countries that did not directly have colonies of their own were involved in the colonial system. Part of the global colonial system, after all, was the circulation of representations that emerged from the colonial imagination. These representations were regionally altered in different ways. They could be approved, condemned, or even defied against. However, this circulation of representation also has implications for the material world. Europeans have economic relations with America that benefit them. Europeans have migrated and are migrating to the Americas and have thus directly participated and are participating in settler colonialism by, among other things, taking land from the indigenous population. After all, many Czechoslovaks emigrated there during the Cold War and brought their ideas and prejudices rooted in the colonial imagination with them. Visions of America and its people also influenced contemporary foreign policy. And after all, let us not forget that a large number of politicians currently in power formed these visions just before 1989.